Welcome. This is week 4, and I'm delighted to see all of you on this day when I think we are going to see the sun and our own shadows. So I am thrilled that you are here. I want to go back again today to where we kind of left off, and I want to add a few more pieces of Nashville history here because I personally think they're so fascinating, and after all, we are living in Nashville, so I think we need to kind of pay attention to all of this. But the very first thing I want to say is I want to say a few words about millennialism. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to have to give you a disclaimer. I know very little about millennialism. It is mostly based on some things in the New Testament book of Revelations. I don't pretend to be a scholar on Revelations. Frankly, it has always scared me. From my formative days when I was growing up out in Texas and had a big brother who, of course, got his driver's license and was squiring me around. And my big brother thought it would be great fun one night to stop at a tent revival in Bonham, Texas, just to see what the experience was like, since we had never been to one of these, and there was always lots of lights and lots of noise. So we stopped at this tent revival and went in and sat down on the back row, and as a 12-year-old child, this scared me to death. I was terrified, and many years later today, I still think back to that. And so I have theologically, I hope I'm not offending you, but Revelation has always scared me. So I'm kind of got the Scarlett O'Hara attitude towards that. But millennialism, I have to say this because this gets to what we're really going to talk about today. Millennialism has to do with a second coming of Christ, and it has to do with a 1,000-year reign. Now, the Puritans were post-millennialists. They believed that pretty much we were in the millennial. And this gave them a sort of a special role. I mean, we're Americans. We are going to help carry out this mission to conquer sin and kill Satan. And that's kind of an American thing. You know, we're going to be exceptionally good at this. So you really have to look at them as saying this event, with this millennial, when it's 1,000 years and the good guys, the saints, are going to triumph, and the bad one, Satan, is going to be defeated. And then Jesus is coming again. All right, now, that's the post-millennialist. And so before the Civil War, you do have these people who are saying, you don't need to be worried about that, because we're going to have the millennial has not come yet. And we are in this period before the millennial has come, and we need to be terrified that when the millennial comes, if we are not emotionally saved right then and there, we're going to hell before the millennial comes. So this is this message of repent, get with it, repent, and it doesn't focus so much on how to live your life with your neighbor. So just keep those kind of basic things in mind. You can find all manner of books and things about this, and if you're really interested in the subject, dispensationalism is another one that's kind of out there, so you can pay attention to that. When we were ending class last week, I was talking about religious intolerance for a little bit, talking about the education system in New York and other places as well. And I want to remind you that this was not an uncommon thing. Religious intolerance has always been here in the United States. And it's my way only. My path is the only path. And you have groups organizing about the time of Andrew Jackson's presidency, like the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. And this is a very anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-anybody nearly group who got kind of nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. A lot of these organizations have a lot of ritual wrapped up in them, and they also have wrapped up in them a lot of secrecy. So the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner comes along, and they nominate some people for office here and there, but they sort of fizzle out. But they remain, and I think it's kind of interesting to think about this group, this intolerant group, going strong. At the same time, some of their own people are preaching and part of this Second Great Awakening that is so far-reaching even to today in some ways. Now, at this same time, before the Civil War, you've got so many wonderful things to study or learn about if you're in an English class that is studying American literature before the Civil War. The Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, their belief in nature and the ideas of nature are there, and that really is a very interesting piece of American cultural history, and there are some ties to religious history. Emerson, for example, became very interested in Swedenborgianism. Now, I bet there probably are lots of people in this room who have never heard of Swedenborgianism, but there are a few churches still around, and they actually started a college up in Ohio, Urbana College, you've heard of that? So the Swedenborgians were the religion that had been sort of founded by a Swedish scientist who had gone to England, and then some of his followers had come here. His ideas traveled over here, and it's very similar to Unitarianism. One God, no Trinity, one God. So the Swedenborgians they identify themselves as the Church of New Jerusalem. But you're going to see a lot of writers, I think, what's his first and second name? Keats Yates, Y-E-A-T-S. What's his name, Jenny? William Butler Yeats, thank you. William Butler Yeats, it takes two here. I didn't teach English, as you can see. I didn't teach poetry. Yeats becomes a Swedenborgian. Emerson certainly dabbles in Swedenborgianism. The American painter George Ennis was a Swedenborgian. And the one that actually, I bet you didn't know she was a Swedenborgian, but really had the most profound influence on the United States was Helen Keller. So you can go Google that too, and I'll tell you how to spell it if you can't phonetically figure out what needs to go in that little box. But the Swedenborgians come to this country, and so you've got Unitarians, Universalism, you've got Swedenborgians, you've got this great diversity which has made this country so rich. And yet at the same time, you've got intolerance growing up. Now, we have a lot of alternative religions, which I'm just going to mention, and you can go examine these further, that really have a little appeal for a long time. Only one, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, really had sticking power and really took and really became an established church. But the others kind of come and go. You have the Millerites. Now, the Millerites, founded by a man named William Miller, followed all of his teachings. God spoke to him, and he was one of these people who loved to take the Bible and do mathematical calculations. Now, I bet a few of you have still know somebody who actually would take the Old Testament and then they would take this verse and do all this mathematical magic and come up and say, guess what? Jesus is coming. And he's coming sometime between March the 21st, 1843, and March the 21st, 1844. All right, Janice, get ready. That was the message. It was simple. Well, March 21st, here's another interesting part. One of his followers started selling ascension robes. Now, wouldn't you love this? If you, marketing, if you, Fred, buy yourself an ascension robe, guess what? You can get to the head of the line. So you can go up to heaven before all these cheapskates back here who wouldn't buy yourself an ascension robe. So it's marketing. Well, March the 21st comes, March the 21st goes, 1844. Oops. Well, not to be outdone, he goes back to his Old Testament, putting it with his New Testament, doing all these numbers. My calculation was wrong. It's going to happen in October. So don't burn your robe yet, Fred. You're still ready to go. So he comes up with a date in October, and it comes and goes. So he sort of loses credibility. But as his crew is sort of lost, I mean, they're really kind of a remnant here. As his crew is sort of lost, you hear a 17-year-old girl saying that she has had a vision. Her name is Mary Harmon, and she will become later known as Mary Harmon White. And this is the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist. And this is their roots. And they definitely do believe that Jesus is coming, but instead of pinning down a date, her way of rationalizing all of this is he's coming soon. The end of the world is coming soon. But her big point was Jesus isn't going to come because we're worshiping on the wrong day of the week. We need to be worshiping on Sunday, all you Christians. Saturday, the seventh day. We don't need to be worshiping on Sunday. So this is out of which the Seventh-day Adventists are born. And I don't know if you've ever had much, there are probably a few people here who are Adventists, but the Adventists, like the Mormons, really developed some very healthy practices that all of us, whatever faith or no faith we may have, really ought to look at. They eat mostly vegetables. Rarely do you find a person who eats meat who is a Adventist. They're very interested in health. They have a lot of doctors who are Adventist doctors. There's a medical school and a dental school out in California. So they're very much interested in healthful taking care of one's body in preparation for the end of the world. And a community was established in Madison, Tennessee after the Civil War, and they had a farm, and then they went up to Portland, Tennessee, which is nearly to Kentucky, and established an Adventist school there and a farm, and part of their methodology was you have to work on the farm to go to the school. And the school is still in existence in Portland, Highland Academy, and there is also another school, I can never remember whether it's Greenbrier or Ridgetop, but there is a small elementary Adventist school in Robertson County. So they have had an impact here, but that came after the Civil War. And the Jehovah's Witnesses were really sort of this part of this Millerite group that comes along, but they don't really come along until after the Civil War. Now, a few words about the Mormons. And I don't think we quite see as many Mormons on the streets as we used to, but we used to always see these very clean-cut young men riding bicycles wearing white shirts, and they were Mormons. And Mormonism is, even today, a very rapidly growing religion. It is a large denomination. And most of you know some part of the story. There was a young man named Joseph Smith. When he was about 20 years old in New York, he had a vision. He said that the angel Moroni came and met with him and gave him these gold tablets, which he later wrote down and translated, and this became the Book of Mormon. It was the Bible for the New World, he said. And what he said, which the Puritans had sort of had this idea, but he really, that had kind of been forgotten about. He said that the Indians were the lost tribe of Israel. So the Puritans had said the very same thing, but nobody paid so much attention to them, but they paid more attention to Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith writes this Book of Mormon. He really, I think, for a little while anyway, kind of forgot about it, but all these people are taken to this. Now, you know, it's kind of interesting how people look at the Book of Mormon, for that matter, the Bible, the Quran, whatever holy scriptures you're looking at. I have to share with you a quote from one of my favorite American writers, Mark Twain. This was long after Joseph Smith had died and Brigham Young had led the group to Utah. But he said reading the Book of Mormon was like reading chloroform in print. He did not like the language. He said it had none of the poetry of the Bible. And you know, Mark Twain was not necessarily known for being a religious leader. But on the other side, John Greenleaf Whittier, on the other hand, a Quaker, was much kinder than Twain. And he said the Mormons speak a language of hope, a promise to weak, heavy hearts, tossed and troubled, who have wandered from sect to sect, seeking in vain for the primal manifestation of divine power. And I think that really is what the Book of Mormon represented. It was a message to people, it was a message of hope, and it was a way of belonging to a community for somebody who had roamed and wandered here and there. So, Joseph Smith said that God spoke to him regularly through revelations. He himself had over 100 of these revelations from God directly to him. His successor, I should say, Brigham Young, only had one revelation from God. But Joseph Smith had these revelations. Now, the most controversial part of his doctrine was 2 points. One is proxy baptism. Now that means that not only do you get baptized to this sort of symbolic rebirth experience, but you can be baptized for all of your ancestors. And so thus the connection between genealogy and Mormonism. And that's why the enormous libraries in Salt Lake City, which are now getting so much of that material online, are so important to the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, because they are very interested in getting baptized for all the people on your family tree. So that was controversial among what I would call mainline Christians, as you would look at all these denominations, whether they were Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Christians, or Catholics. They look down on this notion of proxy baptism. The other one, which is the one you all know about, is plural marriage. And you can look at this in different ways. I certainly have no real insight to this, but you've got a lot of more women following Joseph Smith than you have men. Apparently he was really a charismatic speaker, and you want Women have this urge to reproduce at some point in their lives generally, and you've got more women than men, so you can kind of see that there may have perhaps been a level of practicality in the concept of plural marriage. So I think Smith, anybody who just rises to fame overnight has got to be stunned by their immense popularity and all these people wanting to follow him. But he really realized how much power he had, and he became very comfortable exercising it. So consequently, he's run out of a lot of towns because he offends everybody except his followers. He was not a politician. Now, Brigham Young, excellent political skills, but not so much Joseph Smith. So the fact that they are different causes them to go from New York to Ohio to Illinois. They go all sorts of places, and they talk about discrimination, talk about intolerance. Suddenly the conservative Protestants and the Catholics are bonding together on this one. They're all against the Mormons. And so, as I'm sure many of you know the story, in Nauvoo, Illinois, Smith had been arrested. He was put in jail by the state militia. This is the 1840s. And he is put in jail, and his jailers kill him in an altercation. So Smith is dead, and it is at this point that Brigham Young steps forward as a position of leadership, and he decides to lead the Mormons out of the United States into perhaps Mexican territory. And so the big pilgrimage will take place across the plains, the Rocky Mountains, to Salt Lake City there. And after the Mexican War ends in 1848, that area becomes the territory of Utah. But Brigham Young, he was, in my opinion, very politically savvy. He knew how to deal with the United States government, and so he maintained a lot of political power in that territory, and most Americans didn't really bother him because who wants to live out there, people thought. But of course, if you go to Salt Lake City, it is a beautiful place, and the flowers in those towns in Utah are the most magnificent you'll see anywhere. So the Mormons are a group that had staying power, whereas these other groups did not. Now, there are utopian communities springing up all over the place before the Civil War as well. You know that Louisa May Alcott's father, Bronson Alcott, was a part of a community called Fruitlands. These were educated people, but they believed in some kind of a group that didn't do a whole lot of work, but they were thinking and philosophizing all the time. I know a few people that would like to live in a group like that, but I'm sure you know them too. Another group goes to New Harmony, Indiana. Now, I have never been to New Harmony, but I am told it is a fascinating little historical site to visit right across the Ohio River on almost the southern tip of the state of Indiana. There, a Scottish manufacturer by the name of Robert Owen came over here and started this community, and essentially it was socialism. Private property corrupts. We're not going to have private property. It's going to be all together. And the only problem was that everybody has to work, and you have a lot of freeloaders coming in. And so New Harmony, like so many of these communities, the Ruskin community over in Dixon County, Rugby in East Tennessee, which comes along after the Civil War, they don't last because they can't keep the group under very tight control. Now, the last group I want to mention very quickly are the Shakers. Now, you know, on the surface, you might say the Shakers should be as offensive as the Mormons to people who are intolerant, but actually, everybody liked the Shakers. Nobody had any complaints. their big issue, and of course they were founded by a woman, Mother Ann Lee, their big issue was celibacy. The world is going to end soon. It's coming, so you need to clean yourselves up and give up these ideas of procreation. Now, of course, if you think that the world might not end before I die, who's going to succeed these Shakers when they're all dead? But they did actually, they were very socially conscious. They brought in they took care of orphans, and orphans were a serious problem before the Civil War. So the Shakers themselves lasted longer than you might think, because they filled their ranks with these orphans that they had brought in as children. And they had some funny religious practices, dancing with men on this side of the room and women on this side of the room. And they had some rather odd practices, but they were just so darn nice. They had hospitality. They made beautiful furniture. Sure, come in, and they could cook very well, I understand. So they were not ever really discriminated against. Now, yeah, sure, they were a tiny little group, but they pretty much died out. So you've got all sorts of things going on. Now, as you know, after the Mexican War, things here go from bad to worse. All that land that we got from the Mexican War created a tremendous amount of tension over the institution of slavery. As I said last week, the churches began to split, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and when that happens, there is no hope for the Union. And this really happened right at the tail end of the Mexican War. The big denominations began to split over slavery. And you could go into a Methodist church in Alabama and hear a sermon that was very much paternalistic. Slavery is good. God wants us to take care of these people. You could go into a Methodist church in Boston and hear an abolitionist sermon. And so it was slavery that split the churches. Now, meanwhile, Nashville is growing as a trade center. We don't have a lot of need for slaves here, but there are some people who own slaves, but a lot of the Nashville slaves actually were able to make money, and they functioned pretty well. And so it was not a heavy pro-slavery town. But you see, by the time of the Civil War, we have a synagogue, we have a Lutheran church. German Lutherans have come to town. We have the Catholic Church, which had been built about 1822 or 3, St. Mary's, which is downtown. The building wasn't built till the 1840s, but the congregation was established. You have a Catholic church. You've got a fair amount of diversity for a southern town. And there's wonderful, wonderful histories about all of these communities. Now, this is an old book that was put together, I don't know, maybe in the 60s. And if any of you are interested in the church history in Nashville, I highly recommend this book. Every article is written by a different person. Alfred Leland Crabb sort of spearheaded this. 1972 was when this was published. But if you're interested in this, it's got the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Baptists, the Catholics, and the Jews. So it's all right here, and you can, and the Christians. So all of this is, I enjoy this book. It's ancient, it's out of press, but the narrative is very good. And you can, because different people wrote it. So I highly recommend that. So you've got all these groups here, and the Baptist church had really split. They had had problems with whether or not they should follow the teachings of Alexander Campbell. And so a huge group of the Baptists decide they're not going to be Baptists any longer, and they follow a preacher named Philip Fall, who has become influenced by Campbell, and they, following the lead of people in Kentucky, like-minded folks in Kentucky, start calling themselves simply the Disciples of Christ or the Christian Church. Now, Philip Fall will have some health issues after his church is established, and after Philip Fall decides to resign, they bring in a man named Jesse Ferguson, who is a very, very charismatic preacher. But the problem that they have with him is that he becomes very caught up in what you and I would call New Age religion in the 1850s. He becomes very interested in spiritualism. Spiritualism, this religious idea that through some kind of medium you can speak to the dead. And so he becomes very interested in that, and his church does not like this. They oppose this, so he is pretty much forced out of his pulpit. Philip Fall is brought back. Now this is sort of this is sort of the Vine Street Christian Church history there. And so Philip Fall will be brought back in to be the preacher, and he will be the preacher during the Civil War. And the reason I bring this up, I think this is so interesting. Not only does Vine Street claim this history, but so does the Church of Christ Church on 4th Avenue, right there around the corner from the Ryman Auditorium. So does that church claims this history as well. During the Civil War, every preacher in Nashville pretty much was rounded up and put in jail for some period or another. Short period, but some period, after Nashville seceded, when the Union occupied the city. The reason being, they refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. Now, Gene, do you think that tiny synagogue had a full-time rabbi in 1861? So I wonder if he was included in this group, if he was jailed. That would be interesting, though, wouldn't it, to know about that. Gene has written a huge history of the Jewish community of Nashville, which is very complex, and it's a big book. Yes, Hank? I'm sorry, I have to get back here to hear you.
We all claim the same heritage.
Yeah.
Churches of Christ, all churches of Christ, all disciples of Christ, and all independent Christian churches.
That's right. It's a congregational system of worship. It's organization, I should say. Hank said that all churches of Christ claim the same history of the disciples of Christ and independent churches. And that is correct, because these churches are congregational in their church governance, so there's not a denomination telling you who can preach at your church, telling you what kind of a college degree you have to have, governing you. You've got all kinds of sort of little structures within any town that has 3 or 4 churches, because they govern themselves all slightly differently. So you've got that heritage here, and and if you want to do research on this, I had never been in the Disciples of Christ Library Reading Room Historical Society until about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was writing a paper about a woman who challenged David Lipscomb's position on women in the church. Neither one ever moved 1 iota off of their position. Neither Lipscomb nor Selena Holman. But if you have not been in that building, it is really, lovely. It's across the street from Scarrett. It is really a beautiful building. It's not an old building, but it was built to look Gothic, and it really is quite a lovely place. It's across from Scarrett, kind of on the backside of the university school property there. Really a pretty place. But this history is all sort of complex. Philip Fall did not have to get out of the pulpit. Philip Fall had a Union Jack out in front of his church, the flag of England. Because Philip Fall, although he had come here from Kentucky, he never became an American citizen and saw himself as a citizen of England. And so he was completely neutral on the Civil War. And if you go later in and read some of the columns that David Lipscomb wrote in the Gospel Advocate, you'll see him having these pacifist ideas and a lot of interesting, he writes a lot of interesting things about that. But that was the only church that really stayed open during the Civil War when the Union Army was here. Now imagine coming to Nashville. You can go to St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows after the Civil War. You can hear the Latin Mass. You can go to the Vine Street Temple. You can hear a service in Hebrew. You can go to the Lutheran Church, First Lutheran Church, and your service will be in German. And a woman who is not in this crowd but whom I have met grew up in that First Lutheran Church, and she said that they maintained the German, they were able to maintain the German language in worship through World War I, but World War II was the point at which they gave up using a German liturgy there. So you've got these groups here all in Nashville, and frankly I think Nashville was a place of great diversity, and it was a place of some level of tolerance. There may not have been what you and I would consider complete tolerance, but we of course like to think we're much more tolerant than people who live south of here in those states down there. So I'm not going to say anything about the Civil War other than you know that God was on both sides. And so if you're a Southerner, God was on your side. If you're a Yankee, God was on your side, Fred. So God was on everybody's side. But, you know, for the Southerners, losing was awful. I mean, just think about this. You as a Southerner have had great certitude. You are absolutely sure that you're right. And you lost the war. So if God was on your side, what had you done? And so the South is just in a terrible mess. Not so much Tennessee, but the other 10 states that left the Union, because they are really having to deal with this theological question of what happened here. And it is a profound theological question. And so across the South, lots and lots of clergy lost their status. You know, their credibility level went down, and lots of communities, mainly for financial reasons, were forced to cut their clergy's salary. And so the clergy lose status here, and colleges that have been founded by denominations really become run, rather than by clergy, they are run by lay people who are not clergy. And so you see that happening, and I think you can kind of understand why when the Methodists wanted to establish a college here, the clergy of the Methodist Church, who ultimately got the money from Cornelius Vanderbilt, couldn't maintain the control of their college because they had to sort of let lay people take over. Now, much more so in the South than in the North, but you see this concept coming back that has sort of been around before, but it's much more profound after the Civil War, this concept of a woman's sphere. And this is this whole idea that women are totally helpless, they need to be protected, they can't do anything. And I think Southern women really wanted this. After the Civil War, Drew Gilpin Faust, now president of Harvard, not too bad a job for a woman in academics, do you think? Drew Gilpin Faust has a wonderful book called Mothers of Invention. And she talks about, her theory is that women really in the South brought about the end of the Civil War because after 4.5 years, they said, we've had enough. I don't want to go to another funeral of another woman's son. We have had enough. And they did not like being left in a town or on a farm or even a plantation, having to be in charge. And so after the Civil War was over, Southern women said, please take care of me. I just can't do it anymore. So this whole kind of notion of Victorian womanhood and femininity comes in here. And really, frankly, a lot of clergy were kind of lumped in the same place with women, which was not that respected in the society. Kind of helpless people, we got to take care of those preachers too. And so that takes place. Now, I do want to say that we've got all sorts of moral campaigns going on after the Civil War, particularly before the industrialization of the Gilded Age really takes off. And you have a congressman who says we need to do something to increase our moral purity, to keep our minds clean. His name is Anthony Comstock, and he gets Congress to pass a law that effectively says that women cannot learn anything about birth control. The Comstock laws forbade the carrying of any birth control information in the U.S. mail, and these laws were very discriminatory against women, and so you will know that Margaret Sanger makes a whole career of trying to get these Comstock laws overturned, but when she did begin her campaign for birth control, because her mother had died having children, preachers of all sorts were absolutely adamant in condemning her from the pulpit. They condemned her all the time. So that takes place. Now, the big deal here after the Civil War, let's get it over. Let's forget about that unpleasant. Let's shake hands here, Southerners, Northerners. Let's all shake hands. We finished the Transcontinental Railroad, symbolically reuniting the United States, even though it was east and west, not north and south. I understand. All right, that we've reunited the country. Let's get over this business about who won and who lost. And so what happened is that no one in Congress, and Abraham Lincoln unfortunately was not here to help us through this, no one in Congress who had, the Northerners who had won the war, realized how hard it was going to be to get Southerners who had been in positions of power, meaning rich people who owned slaves and land, to look at their former slaves as equals. It was not going to happen in the South. People in the North did not have any idea how angry that was going to make Southerners. And so when the presidential election of 1876 comes along, the Democrats nominate Samuel Tilden and the Republicans nominate Rutherford B. Hayes, a New Yorker and an Ohioan, both with sterling Civil War credentials and sterling credentials on reformers, let's clean up society. When they do this, when that election takes place, the Northerners are just too tired of all the money it is costing to keep soldiers in the South to protect the rights of the former slaves. So the election is held. It is a very close election. The electoral votes are counted, and the electoral votes of 3 states are questioned, meaning, are these electoral votes really Republican votes, in which if they're Republican votes, that means that Hayes is won, or are they Democratic votes, in which case it means Tilden is won? South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. So, they argue and argue and argue about these votes. They argue and argue and argue some more about these votes. And finally, getting into 1877, a congressional commission made up of, I think, 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats finally comes up with a deal. Now, it's a compromise. It's a deal. It's not we're just going to give it to the Republicans just because there are 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. The Democrats, which are all of the South and some of the North too, the Democrats want one big thing. If we're going to put the Republican in the White House, we want those soldiers taken out of our states. Removal of the troops. They also wanted Postmaster General job, and this was the compromise of 1877. So with that, African Americans in the South had this steady decline in status in the way they were treated that will last all the way up until the 1950s and 60s. So, let's get this country going again. The Transcontinental Railroad was the very first time that we had had a mega corporate structure created in this country, corporations created to build the railroad, and after that is completed, we see corporations appearing everywhere and really creating empires, financial empires, for a few very wealthy men. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the list goes on and on. Now these industrialists, let's just call them industrialists for the moment, are looked upon in a lot of different ways. They are looked upon as robber barons. That's what a lot of people call them. Howard Zinn, if you're familiar with him, he always referred to these as robber barons. They call themselves generally captains of industry. Other historians come along and try to be a little bit more even-handed, so they call them the organizers. They organized a capitalistic financial structure in this country so that the country could industrialize at a very rapid speed and become the wealthiest nation of the world. And so we did that during this period that Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. And you know that that was a name that the country looks really good, but if you look inside, things are not quite as good as they appear. Now, it is at this point that we have a new group of preachers appearing on the scene. These are a new group of preachers who actually can be seen by the capitalists, I will call them, the industrialists, as a group that we can use for our own benefit. Now, do you all remember Watergate? And you all remember when Bob Woodward they were meeting in that garage with Deep Throat? And what was the advice that Deep Throat told the reporters from the Washington Post? Follow the money. These preachers, the one I'm going to talk about is Dwight L. Moody, these preachers who become such megastars are completely financed by industrialists and capitalists. So, how does this happen? Dwight L. Moody grew up in Massachusetts, poor family, father died, he has to work, he ends up in Chicago before the Civil War, selling shoes, finds out that he is a very good shoe salesman. I mean, it is kind of an interesting thing that people who are good in sales are good in preaching, right? So anyway, he gets involved with he joins the Plymouth Congregational Church in Chicago, not to be confused with the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. That's Henry Ward Beecher, but he joins this church and he gets involved in a Sunday school movement. The YMCA is involved in this too. He teaches classes in the basement of the church, and he's doing this before the Civil War. And he makes a distinction, a lot of people do, between teaching and preaching. Nonetheless, when he was teaching these classes in the basement of this church, a politician who will become president, Abraham Lincoln, actually visited his class and watched him there, and it was kind of a phenomenon because he ate with the poor. Moody ate with the poor and is having these classes for the poor. In the Civil War, he's on the Union side, he joins the U.S. Christian Commission. He travels with the Union Army. He goes several places trying to help those who are dying. Not a preacher, but a member of this kind of lay group that's out there with others who are working. So he actually was at the Battle of Shiloh and Murfreesboro, which I find that's a whole really interesting subject to be explored, him coming to Tennessee. But after the Civil War, he goes back to Chicago, starts teaching these classes through the YMCA again, and in October of 1871, he finds himself teaching one of these classes, and he starts hearing people screaming, "Fire, fire, fire." So the big fire burns down Chicago. He gets off into a boat into Lake Michigan there and watches the burning. But he leaves this place, Chicago, after the whole place is burned down. There's not going to be a YMCA for a while there again. And he goes to England. Now, he's relatively unknown anywhere except Chicago at the time he goes to England after the fire. But 2 years in England, and this man is a rock star. He preaches in England, he preaches in Scotland, he is loved, his message is appealing, and before it's all over, he will actually preach in the Royal Opera House. So it is these revivals that make this man famous. And after these revivals, he comes back to Chicago where he says he is going to lead a moral crusade. In other words, we're going to get you all to repent of whatever sinning you're doing. So the newspapers of Chicago suddenly start writing all about this. Now, who owns newspapers? Industrialists, capitalists, and lots of printing is done. Signs are put up all around, posters all around the town, and the newspapers are saying, "Come to hear this man preach. We're going to have this revival." And all of his efforts were always funded by the wealthy. He received support from local businesses. He organized. And so he preaches in Chicago with great success. He goes to Philadelphia. The Wanamaker store owners give him a warehouse to preach in Philadelphia and actually convert it. And he calls this warehouse where he's going to preach in Philadelphia his tabernacle. Now, I think this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. Well, what's the difference between a tabernacle and a church? I mean, the tabernacle that I kind of think of that comes to mind is the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, right? But you know, from the Old Testament, the tabernacle was built out there in the desert. It was temporary. It was not permanent. It was of necessity. You have this tabernacle out there in the desert, and then In the city, in Jerusalem, you have a temple. And so you see this kind of contrast here, tabernacle, temple. What does Sam Jones, who comes to Nashville, get built for him by Captain Ryman? The Nashville Union Tabernacle. So you look at these temples as being intellectual, built with a great deal of money, but also a great deal of intellectualism in the architectural structure. Tabernacle, very plain. So everywhere he preaches, he ultimately gets a tabernacle. Boston built a new tabernacle for him that would hold 6,000 people. Chicago built him a tabernacle that would hold 8,000. When he preached in New York, he got to use P.T. Barnum's old hippodrome, which was converted into a tabernacle for him to be there. And all of the funding for all of this came from the captains of industry. And they realized that his message, Moody's message, will really help control their workers, the poor, and keep them from rebelling. So what was Moody's message? Moody really was a premillennialist. He said, it's about to happen, it's going to happen, you need to repent right now, you need to repent, you need to repent. Don't worry so much about helping these poor people. Focus on yourself and focus on the fact that you're going to get to heaven. And so that was a very powerful message, and he received lots of financial aid to get this message spread all over the country. Jay Cook, Cyrus McCormick, George Armour, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, J.P. Morgan, all gave substantial sums of money to Moody's enterprise. And in the process of having all these revivals, he created an enormous bureaucracy, and he had a large permanent staff, so it's not exactly a tent in the desert with a guy preaching. He has an enormous staff that is paid. Anytime he's going to do one of these revivals, a lead team goes into town to organize the town leadership for the support of this. When the leaders go in, they form from the town leaders an executive committee and a finance committee for the operation. They organize the community resources, take out ads, put up posters, do all of these things. And then as it gets close to the time of Moody's appearance in the revival, you have local lay people recruited who are going to be ushers at these events. They are given badges, they are given training, but you have them scattered throughout the crowd anytime Moody is preaching. They are given long wands so that they can help you. And I thought that was actually quite interesting. And they recruit hundreds of local singers who are going to sing in the revival choir that is led by his partner, Ira Shanky. And so here they come. Ira Shanky wrote a lot of hymns. You can look in some hymn books and find those. And so this whole structure of how to organize a revival comes along. There are inquiry rooms put alongside of the tabernacles. Everybody who makes a decision is given a card. You fill out the card. You have a record of who has been saved. You can use that for fundraising later. It really is a kind of a combination of showbiz and management and religion. Now here we've got these preachers of the Second Great Awakening that I mentioned last week, like Francis Asbury, the Methodist who came over here, who had a profound influence on this country, Charles Grandison Finney in upstate New York along the Erie Canal. That was the age of Andrew Jackson, tent revivals, camp meetings, that kind of thing. Moody is the age of Andrew Carnegie and P.T. Barnum. And you see this in everything he did. If you want to read about Moody, there is a really good biography of him, God's Man for the Gilded Age or something. But if you want a little bit less than a biography, that fairly new book by Gary Wills, Head and Heart, has an excellent chapter on Moody in it, and a lot of the information that I know about Moody came from Gary Wills. I think he's a fine writer. Now, let me read a little one of his sermons, because I think Moody really isn't focused on social concerns, the poor, the homeless, the helpless. Here is a quote from a sermon. When I was at work for the City Relief Society of Chicago before the fire, I used to go to a poor sinner with a Bible in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. My idea was that I could open a poor man's heart by giving him a load of wood or some coal when the winter was coming. But I soon found out that he wasn't any more interested in the gospel because I had fed him because he was hungry, given him something to warm himself when he was cold. So, instead of thinking how this man, could come to Christ, he was thinking, how long would it be before he got another load of wood? If I had the Bible in one hand and the loaf of bread in the other, the people always looked first at the loaf, and that was what they were really interested in, and that was just the contrary of the order that had been laid out in the gospel. So he says, don't do all these things for people. You know, people, you're poor, work hard, buck up, accept the money that Carnegie is paying you to work, and don't complain about the hours or the wages. And so he preaches this gospel that is very popular and very pervasive in American society during the Gilded Age. I do not believe we would have these hard times, a panic, a depression, if it had not been for sin and iniquity. Look at all the money that is drank up. And what about doing something for the workers? Maybe a 10-hour day? 8-hour day's a long way off here. You got to be kidding. Give something to do. If it is for 15 hours a day, all the better. For while you are at work, Satan does not have much of a chance to tempt you. I'm going to remind myself that when I'm grading papers at 1 a.m. tonight. If you cannot earn more than $1 a week, earn that. It's better than nothing, and you can pray to God for more. Now, do you get how this message is? You can see why the industrialists, how this really, really appealed to them. So he goes on, and he dies in 1899, profound, a huge funeral, but a profound influence on this country and preachers that will come after him. And you really can see how he is tied to anybody who has been an evangelist since in the 20th century. Some estimates say that he preached to more than 100 million people, and he liked to say he had reduced the population of hell by 1 million people. So don't underestimate this man, although a lot of people have kind of forgotten him. They only remember that he had this school, the Moody Bible Institute, which is still in effect. Martin Marty, who is a retired religious history professor from the University of Chicago and a Lutheran whom I met last year, said this about Dwight L. Moody. At a critical stage of American religious history, the Chicago-based evangelist could plausibly have been called Mr. Revivalism or Mr. Protestant. And clearly, he was the vanguard of religious fundamentalism that comes after the 20th century. This sense of urgency, you've got to convert because Christ is coming soon. And so you see lots of people taking these ideas and going forward. And simultaneously, we have this secular side of the Gilded Age with people like Horatio Alger writing all these books about Ragged Dick. And Ragged Dick, you know, is this poor kid who works hard and gets very, very wealthy. He wrote over 100 books for kind of middle school, teenage boys, very, very popular books. And so finally, somebody is going to say, I think we need to help these poor people a little bit. And so you see Jane Addams with the settlement house movement in Chicago, Hull House. You should go out there and visit that site sometime. It's a train ride, but it's a really interesting place. You see a lot of women's groups becoming very involved in this settlement house movement. There are Catholic settlement houses, Jewish settlement houses, but we need to help the poor. And you see these two strains kind of going apart, coming back together, going apart. So it's an interesting thing to consider as we move into the 20th century. So, in conclusion, next week we will look at fundamentalism really expanding after World War I. We will talk about the Scopes trial. We've got yet another star preacher, and that will be Billy Sunday, the baseball player, who you just gotta love him. And he is a razzmatazz, but a great preacher. So we've got some interesting things next week. Thank you very much.